I thought the introduction was kind of funny because I was wondering if like Gandalf always intended on picking Bilbo or if he just was kind of like did it out of pettiness because he got annoyed at him for like how he was like talking to him. Because like I don't think that's outside of Gandalf to just kind of be like, you know what, I'm gonna invite like 14 dwarves or 13 dwarves over to this man's house without telling him.
Hi, I'm Evelyn.
I'm Robert.
I'm Amy.
I'm Evie.
And we're talking about it. Our intro episode that came out at the same time as this introduces Amy and Evie, who are going to be hosts with us while reading The Hobbit. Short version, this is the only Tolkien work that I have actually read. So we asked them because they haven't really read The Hobbit before. Evie has never read anything of The Hobbit, and Amy technically listened to it once and completely forgets it. So, but they're both big Tolkien fans. They have been on our movie episodes, and we're really excited to have you guys.
So
Excited to be
welcome.
here. Thanks.
All right. So we'll just kind of dive into it. We have chapter one, an unexpected party. Now, before we get in, I kind of forgot to ask you guys before you started reading it. So I don't know if you guys did do this. So if not, we'll just do it for later chapters. But did you guys make any guesses about like what would happen in this chapter before you started reading it?
I guess
Oh,
I
sorry.
guess something would happen. That was my prediction.
Fair.
The party was going to happen.
Yeah, party.
Yeah, definitely a party, definitely a gathering. Um, I think this is the only part of the movie that I really remember too. So I had an idea that a bunch of dwarves were going to show up and Bilbo was going to be like, what the heck?
Pretty much, yeah. Just a random tidbit before we even start reading is the first chapter is called An Unexpected Party. Meanwhile, the very first chapter of Lord of the Rings is a long-awaited party.
Oh, a little bit of symmetry there.
Yeah. I just thought that was like just a cool little
Yep.
tidbit, you know? Just I thought that was just really interesting. Yeah. But
I'm
yeah,
shaking my head yes, like everybody can see me doing that. Yeah.
right, because we're a completely audio podcast. Uh So it immediately starts with that very famous phrase that I didn't write down. But in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. I didn't need to write it down. We all know this. And it goes on to describe just a really comfortable home, noting that the owner was fond of visitors and he had lots of clothes and lots of pantries filled with food.
Right. Well, one of the things I found interesting in the description of the Hobbit hole, it says it's full of bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of them, wardrobes. He had whole rooms devoted to clothes.
Mhm.
So he was a clothes hound.
Well, he was a fancy boy. He liked his luxuries.
Yep. So the hole in the ground is much like Mole's home in The Wind and the Willows, by Kevin Graham from 1908. Just the way some of the things are described and the massiveness of the house.
Yeah, which is pretty cool similarities.
Yes.
And then we have someone very interesting with us who has actually seen some of them. Do you mind if we ask you a little bit about it, Amy?
Yeah, yeah. I was lucky enough to go to Hobbiton this past October and get to visit the Shire. And it was basically the most beautiful place I've ever been. Very much just spectacular scenery, just like the movie. We also were lucky enough to go there the day we were supposed to go. There was a horrible thunderstorm, and so we ended up moving our day one day later, and it ended up being perfect weather, beautiful sunshine, exactly what you see in the movie. And we got to see everything, and it's fully built in to this gorgeous countryside in New Zealand.
Were you able to go inside any of them or just see the outsides?
So they're currently in construction to build interior hobbit holes. But
Mm.
everything that was built for the actual movie was all just exterior shots, and they had to build a set um, separately for the interior shots of the Hobbit hole. The only Hobbit hole that actually has any partial interior work done is Bilbo's home
Okay.
at Back End. Yeah. And it's just that interior like sliver of the hallway
Mm.
going in. So you just see a little creak of the door open. But they did a lot of perspective work too. So they had some hobbit holes that were designed for if you were playing a hobbit to be like kind of normal size. And then they had ones for like Gandalf or the larger characters to stand next to so that it would be like, you know, very small in comparison. And then they would cut the two together in order to make those shots, which is very cool.
That is
It's
cool.
also, yeah, and it's also a completely working farm. So they have sheep on there, they have an apiarist, they have people who tend all of the gardens, and everything is kept up, which is very cool.
That is neat. We get this great introduction to what a hobbit hole is and kind of what a hobbit is. And that's when now you can talk about it, where we are finally introduced to Bilbo and who his family is.
In the book itself, it talks about him having bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, and then it says lots of them. Wardrobes, where he had whole rooms devoted to clothes.
We said this part.
I know we did, but I thought you want me to say it again here.
Okay.
Okay.
Just reiterating just how posh this is.
And actually Tolkien wrote, it's a hobbit hole, and that means comfort.
Tolkien himself considered himself a hobbit.
Well, of course he did.
Yeah. And we kind of consider ourselves hobbits a bit.
Well, and I think hobbits were supposed to be like representative of England too. Like the whole idea is that it's supposed to be very bucolic, very like in English countryside too, right? So I
Yeah.
think that was like what the hobbits were supposed to embody as well.
Right.
I actually had some beef with Tolkien for one line he did for describing like Bilbo's family. I don't know if you want me to
Okay.
call him out on that
Yeah,
now.
absolutely.
Heck yeah.
The line where he says, "Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins." I feel like that's unnecessary hostility towards women.
I would agree. But it also kind of, to me, shows the difference between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, where in Lord of the Rings, while there's still very limited women, each woman is extremely powerful and important. And I think this, again, kind of shows that the hobbits do have this kind of a little bit of a sexist society where it's like traditional gender norms.
I mean, I haven't read
And
Lord of the Rings, so like the only thing I have heard about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings in general is that it's rather sexist, and that like I know a lot of people were mad that like in the movies allegedly women do more than like they do in the books. And obviously like they have a party of like 14 or 16, they're all men. So like I
yeah.
don't know, I was just a little like peeved by that. I still am enjoying the book. I just like I noticed that and I was like, this is kind of aging the book by having a
Mhm.
line like that.
For sure. But I also think it kind of sets that tone too of like where Bilbo is coming from and like this very strict, structured society.
Oh yeah, I mean, I
And
think
when we
he's
get,
definitely upholding that. Like he's basically saying
yeah,
like I did wonder if like there was an implication that she had adventures when she was younger. But, like I've definitely
Mhm.
seen that trope
yeah,
before that once a woman gets married, like she's just meant to be a mother, she's not meant to do anything else. So like,
right.
that's just
I
it's just
think there,
irritated me a little bit.
no, I agree. I definitely think it was an unnecessary thing, but I also think it is supposed to demonstrate Bilbo's like closed-mindedness too. And then as he goes, I don't know if he opens his mind
Right.
any further, but
Because
um,
yeah, it just really drives home that that hobbits just do not go on adventures. And so Bilbo's father comes from wealth, and his mother comes from even more wealth on the Took side. And so when she married the very respectable Baggins, it was kind of along the lines of not just that she can't have adventures, but she's becoming a proper, respectable hobbit that doesn't go on adventures. That
Yeah.
I'm getting lots of Saxville Baggins vibes from that whole statement. But
I mean, I didn't
yeah.
necessarily interpret it as like a reflection of their culture, just as something that a man writing this story in the 1930s would think for women. You know, like, of course, women
Mhm.
don't go on adventures. I'm not actually sure if there are any like major female characters in The Hobbit, because again, I haven't read it, so I know nothing.
That's fair.
They add them in the movie because in The Hobbit there really isn't. But when you read Tolkien's other works, it is true he doesn't have a lot of women, but each woman that he has is like a ruler in their own right, very powerful, very respected. And he even has like this short story basically equating his wife to a goddess. So,
Right.
yeah. So he does respect women, but he definitely writes from a limited male perspective.
And something else that's interesting since we're talking about that. So Bag Inn, the name Bag Inn is a local name for his aunt's farm in Worcestershire.
I'm sure
Like
that's how you say that.
like Worcestershire sauce. She was Jane Nia. And he visited her a lot.
Okay.
But I thought that was cool that he even had a connection to, a place called Bag Inn.
That is really neat. I didn't know that before.
Yeah.
It just really goes to show that Bilbo, it kind of talks about how he was much more of his father than he was of his mother in the Took side. But more just that he never had an opportunity for an adventure. And I love how he says until he was about 50, just passed from young adult to adult. So it's like he's not just a young adult anymore. He is an adult. He is established. And that's just kind of what he is doing now, and has settled into a comfortable hobbit existence. And it even like describes that comfortable hobbit existence where where Dad was talking about, I can't just say you anymore since there's more than two people now, where Robert was talking about the pipe just being so big.
Oh, the pipe.
And
Yeah, the pipe is
that stuff.
described as going all the way down to his feet.
Yeah.
And that has got to be a luxury item because it says it's made out of wood too.
Yeah.
It's got to be a luxury item. Plus, you have to be a very big homebody to be able to even sit down and have time to smoke a pipe
Right.
if it's that ornate.
Yeah. And not only that, he's able to smoke. He's very proud that he can send smoke rings over the hill, which is just interesting. And you mentioned a little bit more about his lifestyle too, which would fit here, about possibly being like an investor and everything.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, my D&D group, we at one time were having a discussion about Bilbo, and I don't remember who brought it up, but talked about how Baggins seems to be old money.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And that he was probably an investor.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a thing in there about people, because when he heard somebody knock on the door, he thought it was somebody coming to ask to borrow money.
Right.
So, I mean, and it doesn't sound like that upset him.
Mm-hmm.
So that might have been part of, what he did. And we also have to remember the ones that had their homes built into the side of the hill were the richer ones.
Right.
Because it took so much more to build those homes. And
yeah. And with how big his house is.
Right. Yeah, and just lots and lots of rooms. I mean, he's got pantries and cellars.
Right.
It's not a pantry, not a cellar.
It's yeah.
So yeah, which I thought interesting
excessive
too.
On the
But going
best
back
of
to
days.
Bella, yeah. But I want to go back to Belladonna for a minute because the reason we know about Belladonna at all is because Gandalf is chastising Bilbo for not being like his mother.
Right. And that's exactly what we were getting into. So we're introducing Gandalf. And before Bilbo even knows who it is, the narrator says it's Gandalf, which means sure trouble. What did you guys think about like just this whole introduction to Gandalf and like Bilbo realizing who it is and how he's talking and chatting with him?
I love that there's this kind of moment where, and I don't know if it's just the way that Andy Serkis reads him in the audio that I'm listening to, but he kind of just goes like, "Oh my God, you're Gandalf. You set all these fireworks. Everyone hates you." But he's like very excited about it, but also like, "Oh no, that's so like bad of me." It's so cute and funny to like see him be like, "Oh, it's you. You're the talk of the town." Kind of a moment.
Right. Yeah, because
I
his memories of him are the fireworks.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I thought the introduction was kind of funny because I was wondering if like Gandalf always intended on picking Bilbo or if he just was kind of like did it out of pettiness because he got annoyed at him for like how he was like talking to him. Because like I don't think that's outside of Gandalf to just kind of be like, you know what, I'm gonna invite like 14 dwarves or 13 dwarves over to this man's house without telling him.
Right. I mean, whose house would you go to? I mean, he can feed
True.
13 dwarfs,
Yeah.
and
I think he was I always kind of read it that he was thinking about Bilbo, but once he actually met him, he knew he made the right choice. Because one thing that stood out to me is that he does talk about like oh you like Tolkien uses the word prosy where Bilbo is not as prosy as he thinks he is. And prosy is like an older word meaning like dim-witted and slow. And Bilbo likes to imagine that he's like that, which is very Hobbit like, but he's actually quite clever. And twice while he's saying that's just like you upset things around here, he almost slips almost saying the word interesting before he's like you upset things. So I can see that from the audiobook. That sounds exactly like I imagined it in the book.
time to talk about Gandalf.
Oh yes, it is actually.
Okay.
Yeah, so you had so just quickly, just to kind of wrap that part off. So like Gandalf basically is like sending you on an adventure, just like you guys said. And Bilbo, like, he's still so polite, but now he's like distressed polite,
Well, I
being
also
like,
like
no.
I also like how at first it's good morning, as in welcome. How are you today? And then it becomes dismissive.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
It's like
Yeah,
good morning.
that was where I was saying like I think that he was like, oh, good morning means that now. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just
I
fun.
mean, it's like good day, sir. Slam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Gandalf just laughs and he scratches a mark on the door.
His newly painted door.
Yeah. And then yeah, I think this is a good time to go ahead and talk about Gandalf.
Okay. So
We've gone into more detail in our Lord of the Rings, but this is specifically about the naming of Gandalf.
yeah. So Gandalf comes from an old Norse catalog. I'm doing air quotes like people can see me.
Mhm.
From the catalog of dwarf names. And all the dwarfs except for Balin is mentioned in this catalog of dwarf names. That catalog goes all the way back to 1270 in the Norse myths. And what's really interesting is in his first drafts, he has the character that we now know as Thorin named Gandalf.
Mhm.
And then Gandalf was named Balderthin, which is a name he ends up taking again, but it's like in the annexes and the
Yeah.
indices and stuff like that. There's a name of a king of old. So you don't even know, but
It just changes it just changes Gandalf so much
yeah,
in your mind with that name.
right. And Gandalf, in Old Norse, Gandalf means staff elf.
Yeah.
Uh,
I trust.
there's a lot of people who write about the fact that he looks like Odin looks like when he's wandering around,
No,
gray, long
but
gray beard, wearing
we
gray clothing.
we really get into that in the Lord of the Rings one, so I just don't want to.
Oh, I know. I just
Yeah.
talk to it, and um, but as far as the way it's written,
Hmm.
I really like how it's written like a verbatim.
Hmm.
Amy, did you have to do verbatim reports when you were doing clinicals?
When I don't know if I've ever heard of that verbatim.
So yeah, so when I was going through um, clinical pastoral education, we would have to write up at least one about one of our visits a week.
Ah,
And
I see.
and it was like we try to remember it word for word, and then what we thought about it, and what we thought we did good, what we thought we did bad,
Yeah, we
and
did
then
do that.
the rest of your fellow students will rag on you and beat you up for not doing this or for doing that. I got a great story, but we won't go now.
No.
It's a better story than Jane Jett story.
Jane Jett?
Jane Jett, I know.
Oh, we've heard that one before.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
No, we're not. Never ask Robert his Joan Jett story. Because you've probably already heard it. No, okay. Um, so that's when we get introduced to the rest of the party, this unexpected party. And I gotta know first, guys, what were your impressions of just this whole entire thing of just the dwarves coming in and Bilbo's reaction?
They're so rude. Like, I mean, it reminded me of like very like Jane Austen, where like during like there's a certain point in like British upper society where if somebody comes over, like you have to host them. And so like Bilbo was definitely like doing that, where he's like, oh, I have to, I did enjoy that, like in his head, he's like, well, I guess I'm not gonna be eating tonight because
Yeah.
there's all these people coming in and I have to feed all of them. Like I definitely thought it was very comical. I really enjoyed just kind of like his general like flusteredness, but like he's too polite to actually be like, what are you even doing here? Like he doesn't figure out until like, I don't know, isn't it like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning that the reason they even showed up to his house.
And
Yeah.
one of the things, like one of the things that Bilbo says that I think is hilarious is he thinks to himself, they began to arrive, and then he immediately is like, "That's not the correct way to say this."
Yeah, he's like going through how to figure out, how he feels versus how the edited version that he's been living in. But I also like the one thing that kind of stood out to me is I don't remember any of the dwarves' names, so I'm just gonna say that up front. I am never gonna remember everyone who's named the same, but I love that
That's totally
they
fair.
describe I love that they describe them, the first ones who come in with those big blue beards too. And it's definitely something that you don't normally think of, like of someone with like these big bushy pastel beards, and also that similar feeling of like, man, I would hate hosting 14 dwarves who just like run around wild, eating
Yeah.
everything and throwing everything around. There
And
was
he's
one
not just, I was just gonna say, it's not just hosting, they're requesting stuff, and he's like, of
yeah,
course, of course.
Yeah, it's like,
yeah,
oh, and then Gandalf says, bring out the cold chicken. It's like, how does he know I got a cold chicken?
right. And then also like the I know I'm jumping ahead, but like when they're all getting ready to leave or whatever, and they're getting ready to wind down for the night, and everyone gives him their breakfast order as if he's gonna make them a perfectly made breakfast.
Right.
But I also loved that they have that whole song about smashing the plates and putting everything away. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah,
at
it was
the
almost like they
very
were
last,
making fun of him.
yeah. And then the very last slide. And of course they did none of those things.
Right.
It
Well,
was
because
just
that's
very
what
cute.
Bilbo Baggins hates.
Yeah. It definitely made me think of like children's story, very much like trying to teach someone manners too, which I thought was very sweet.
Yeah. So we learn that pretty much all the rhyming names are their brothers, or they're either brothers or cousins.
Yeah.
So at least that's one way to kind of remember everything. So it's like Dwalin and Balin are brothers, Killy and Philly are brothers. Beerford, Beaufort, and Bomber are all cousins. Dory, Nori, and Ori are brothers, and Owen and Glowin are brothers.
Right. But what's, you were talking about it earlier, Amy, that I mean, I think it was when I started working on my graduate degrees that I ever wondered about where the world he got these names from. Because I mean, because I was always taught that that's an improper way to name your characters in a book. You don't make them rhyme. You don't have five characters whose names all start with B. How are you going to keep that straight in your mind? And you would think that in the beginning, when he talks about the color of their cloaks, they'll keep talking about that, to help you keep them separated. But they
no.
don't. I mean, it's almost like you have to. I mean, if you really want to keep track of, you're going to need to come up with some type of whiteboard.
Right. But like we say all the time, Tolkien was not a writer when he wrote this. He did not follow the conventional rules, and yet he still came up with something that's completely magical because he didn't do this.
Yeah, but partly also that the reason it's magical is because he wrote in the style of all those old tales that he studied and taught.
Right.
I really liked sorry, I was gonna say I really liked the writing style because like I really enjoy fantasy books where they don't necessarily like over explain things because I'm like, it's magic, you don't have to explain it. And I was kind of laughing when reading it because the writing style reminded me of Diana Wynne Jones, who wrote Howl's Moving Castle, and she actually studied under Tolkien and C.S. Lewis at I think it was Oxford. So I was like, oh, I can see she was their student. Like this is the first time I've read someone who looks similar to her writing style. So I thought that was fun too.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Solid.
There's some fun stories about how she drove Tolkien insane because he didn't actually want to lecture, and she just kept showing up to his lectures.
I love that. Hilarious, actually. But yeah, I was only going to mention real fast about the dwarves. That something that we will notice that it is like throughout the book, like each dwarf will eventually like have a moment, but something that his editors actually convinced him to do is he simplified their roles, where unfortunately like some of the dwarves, they're more background characters to simplify the writing style because it was going to get really hard to keep track of who is who. Because I will bring up the Council of Elrond chapter where I had to read it 3 times and I still wasn't entirely sure what was going on until we recorded the episode and I just kept asking questions. It was a lot.
And the other thing is, so when they want to start talking about the dark things, which part of that is the music, the song that they've have about the Misty Mountain.
Yeah, so
they all of them pull out instruments.
Just any instruments. Instruments.
Let's get a drum.
Which again, I had it for you guys. So I will say now that the Misty Mountain song is probably my favorite song that Tolkien has. What did you guys think of the song and like the setup for everything through it?
I mean, I liked it. I didn't know there'd be songs, so I was like, oh, cool, there's songs. Nice.
It's a musical. The book is a musical. We're gonna tell you now.
It's hot.
It's funny to kind of it's funny to kind of like think through my first experience trying to read this book and being like, God, the songs are so like there's just too many of them. I can't get through them. They don't make sense, whatever. And to like experience them again and be like, okay, I kind of see how these will impact it a little bit, I guess. Like it's telling essentially like why. But I loved at the end of the chapter when what's the main dwarf? What's his name?
Thorin.
When Thorin is like, didn't you hear my song? You're supposed to help us on this quest. And Bilbo is like, you have to tell me in plain language what the fuck you want me to do. Oh, sorry. Um, and it's like they're just like, I'm sorry, we sang a song for you. We're telling you what we want. You said you'd be a burglar. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know. It was just kind of interesting to see that play out.
But all of
Are
them know
hobbits
this song
known?
already too.
Are hobbits known for being burglars? Like, are they like? Why do they think that this little man? I mean, other than the fact that he's just tiny and he's real good at like walking quiet, is good for burglaring.
It's purely Gandalf.
No, it's not.
Okay.
Well,
So,
good, but they're not known as burglars. Gandalf is kind of just like they're perfect for it.
but I think it's in the next chapter when it talks about how hobbits are naturally quiet, even walking through the woods.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's
And
what
so
I
that's
got
part of
once
being
I
a
got to the
burglar.
second. Sorry if I'm skipping ahead.
No, it's fine.
No, and
But yeah, I also
he
appreciated
has.
where. Sorry, I was gonna say I also appreciate where Gandalf's like, this is the best I could do. Like everybody else who's actually a legitimate hero is busy, so take him or leave him.
Well, yeah, I mean, he does do that. He says, "Well, we can't get any heroes because they're all fighting in distant lands, and we can't get these because they're all doing this."
Yeah. But just back to the song real fast, because again, because I remember watching the animated movie before reading the book, and I remember like the songs were an important part of that. So I guess that's why I never had a problem reading the songs. But what this particular song does is I think it beautifully articulates, like, because even Bilbo is deeply moved, it can feel exactly what's being described. It completely articulates this amazing great empire full of great riches, and then it was all just devastated and taken away from them, and he can feel their pain and he can feel their longing to want it back. And I think that's one of the reasons I like it so much, is because we have not only this beautiful song, but Bilbo is moved so deeply with how they're singing it.
Yeah.
And like Dad said, you can tell they've played this before, and it's probably like one of their like folk songs that came out of the whole situation.
And talking about knowing the songs, I remember the first time you and Alex saw the animated Hobbit was when we were living in Plymouth, which like
Yeah.
long time ago.
Yeah.
And
yeah, we would literally
Alex,
just have it on while like we would watch on the TV in your office. You would listen to it and we would watch it.
Yeah.
And we did that a lot.
Right. But Alex can still sing, chip the glasses, crack the plates, blunt the knives, and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates.
Yeah. And I can sing the whole, like, he knows all of the words to that, and I know all the words to Misty Mountain.
Yeah.
Which I love. Yeah.
So,
but Alex remembers everything.
That's true.
Yeah, he's an elephant.
If he didn't remember, it didn't happen.
Yeah, pretty much. But yeah, so I love that. But like you said, dark for dark business. And I love how Thorin starts to explain things in a very long-winded way. And I immediately went, yeah, the Lewises are hobbits, because I admit to doing that. You do that. Grandpa certainly does. So yeah, we're definitely hobbits as well. Or dwarves, I guess, in this case. But Bilbo said that it's common for hobbits as well.
Yeah.
And it's I think it's just really funny because they're like, yeah, Thorin could have kept stating the things they already know until he got to the part where they may never return. And
what do you mean we never return?
Right, Bilbo just shrieks this like guttural screech and then just passes out. And that's and Gandalf tries to defend him, and in defending him, we get. Did you guys catch this? Basically how golf was invented. Did you guys catch that part?
I love
that.
that line.
I forgot about it until I
this is where it was.
Yeah.
I did forget that this is where it was, but we just get this random moment of, yeah, one of Bilbo's ancestors was so big he could ride an actual horse, and he was fighting goblins, and he knocked one's head off right into a rabbit hole, and because his name was Golfer, that's how the game golf was invented. And then he just moves on.
Yeah.
Like, Yeah, that's normal.
This is this is Bull Roaster's Took.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did like get confused later because he does ride a horse. So I was like, okay, is that not
He
like
rides a pony, a very small
okay,
pony.
a
Yeah.
pony? All right.
Yeah, so think of it as ponies, not as young horses, but think of like kind of Shetland ponies, where that's as big as they get.
Okay.
That's what the
Girl
dwarves and
Scout
the
was what I
hobbits
had in my
ride.
head. That's fine.
No, yeah, that's because in the Lord of the Rings, we see two of the hobbits, Merry and Pippin, end up riding with like people on horses, and they have a very hard time staying on
Right.
with
Yeah.
it.
When you watch it in the movie, it looks like almost like Gandalf's holding a toddler.
Well, he is.
Well, I know, but I mean,
The
yeah.
size actors were literal toddlers.
Yeah, they were really little.
Yeah.
It's wild to see
Um,
those scenes.
but yeah, Bilbo wakes up and hears them like talking about him. And I love how he says he foolishly decides to defend himself. Like he thinks of himself as foolish for being like, no, I have adventuring in the blood. And they're like, but do you though? Um, and that's when we have like Gandalf talking about distant lands, and he ends up pulling out this map by Thorin's grandfather, and that tells of a secret door and its key. And Thorin's like, great, let's go. And that's exactly what Amy said. Bilbo's like, no, 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 no. I need proper details. Like, I really need to know what is going on. Which, yeah, they're like, you heard the song, right? But we definitely get more of an in-depth feel for these dwarves here. And something that I didn't mention earlier is in their description, when they're all being introduced, they are shown to have silver or gold belts, which is just part of their description at the time. But once you kind of learn this information, to me, it kind of changes. And it's something I only noticed this rereading. So Thorin talks about how his people, they were so rich. They didn't bother with like food or necessities because they could just buy whatever they needed. And basically he was a small child. He was the equivalent of a 8 to 10 year old. And he was just happened to be lucky to be outside when the dragon attacked, and how the dragon was drawn to its riches, because the dragons are just full greed creatures. And the dragon, we later learn the name is Smog, and which I love that name for a dragon, like Smog.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
like
and if you think about like industrial England too,
Yeah.
like
yeah,
thinking about like what that would represent for someone, and like kind of being such a negative imagery and such like a great word.
yeah, with just how terrible. And Tolkien would have known about it because he was born and grew up as a child at the very end of that industrial revolution
Yeah.
type thing. And that was one of his, like in the Lord of the Rings, he kind of describes the evil side doing like industrial type things, making the air unbreathable. And he was always very big on needing technology to advance, but also needing to preserve nature at the same time. He was definitely a naturalist his whole life, which is really interesting. But yeah, Smog killed a majority of the dwarves, especially those that were trapped inside with him.
Not just kill, but ate.
Yeah, he ended up eating them. And then he started to eat the people in the town, because the town that was by them also was extremely prosperous.
That's where they get that's where
they get
got
the
their supplies from.
necessities.
Yeah.
And so they gave them the money, and they were a really big city. And I love how there's just the line where that he drives people away to eat, but mostly maidens.
Not mostly, yeah.
But mostly maidens. And that harks back to what Evie was saying earlier, where it's just like, really? I mean, at the same time, I was like, really? But I'm like, that's classic fantasy for you.
Yeah.
So
So, was there anything either one of you liked or disliked that we haven't talked about already?
I don't think so. I mean, I enjoyed it. Like, it's definitely like a fun way to start a story. I think I like the biggest things I noticed is just kind of like the writing style and the sexist comments. But other than that, it's definitely fun and it's very whimsical. Oh, I think I had more comments for like chapter 2 for like where I realized I was like, yeah, this is definitely what Dungeons and Dragons ripped off.
Oh yeah, well,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. The guy that wrote Dungeons and Dragons, like he was like that was 90% of his inspiration was Tolkien's works.
Yeah.
Um,
And I know we're going to talk about this in another episode somewhere.
but you can mention this one thing. I know what you're going to say.
Yeah. So when Gygax wrote the first set of rules and everything for Dungeons and Dragons, he was calling them hobbits, and the estate told him he could not use that name, and so that's why in the D&D world they're halflings.
Yep. Because they are called halflings in Lord of the Rings a little bit too, but that's not what they're known for. And the Tolkien estate has Hobbit trademarked. So
Yeah,
that's why he went with halflings.
Because of Matt, my husband. He's a really obnoxiously big Lord of the Rings fan. Yeah, I mean, I even think that like just like the way the journey starts off, where he's just kind of like, it's like the hero's call or whatever, and it's very D&D and like just kind of people messing around, and then okay, well now we're gonna go on like this journey that might kill us. So that's just it's a fun way to read a story.
No, it is. And I love how like in the door, out the door Bilbo is the entire time, where he's like obviously intrigued by the story, but is also like, I can't, I'm a proper person.
Yeah. The only other thing that at the very end is, I'm surprised you didn't bring it up because you're the one that brought it to my attention, is so we just kind of learn a little bit more that like Thorin, his grandfather was the king in both.
Oh, I had that. Oh,
yeah.
I got the timeline.
Yeah. So, yeah, you go ahead and just say this timeline because my little thing is part of that.
Okay. So I always have to go down that rabbit hole. So this is Middle Earth timing, not
The Third Age.
Yeah, it's the third age.
The Third Age, not by a Hobbit reckoning, which the Lord of the Rings does.
So in the year 2770 is when Smaug took over. Then Thorin's grandfather was killed in the mines of Mordia in the year 2790. 3 years later, the War of the Dwarfs and Orcs started. And then 9 years later, the Dwarfs win that war. And then 2941 is when Bilbo takes off on the adventure. So there's 171 years between when Smaug took the Dwarven homeland and them going out to try to take it back.
And they mention that his father also took the map and attempted to find that secret passage. And I didn't think anything, but he was taken by a necromancer and he did not survive. But then you told me something that I didn't realize.
The necromancer is Sauron.
Yeah.
And no way.
For those who can't see our audio only podcast, Amy's face just like pure like, oh my gosh, it was great.
It's wild. My mind was just blown.
Yeah. And then speaking of, even in I can't remember which one of the three in the Lord of the Rings movies, the brown wizard is told by the birds that the necromancer is moving. And if you don't know, you're like, well, why is he throwing something in that doesn't have?
Yeah. Which, we'll get there when we get there. It's just, yeah. The only other things before we go into chapter 2 is that, first, we wanted to add just slight more context for all the listeners as well as for you guys. So first, there is a very, very interesting reason why dwarves is spelled the way it is in Tolkien's works. This is one of my favorite stories.
So the editors, well, so Tolkien wrote it like wives, with a plural, VES.
Yeah.
Since the word dwarf ends in an F. And the publishers are saying, no, it's FS.
Which is how it had always been spelled prior to this.
Right. And it was kind of like, well, you know what? I'm the one writing the story. We're going to spell it the way I want it spelled. He says, I'm the linguist here.
Yeah. He's just like, everyone else has been wrong for centuries. I am fixing it here now. That's how much of a language nerd he was, guys. It's just so funny.
He found his calling, that's for sure.
And then just some more background that you don't really, that it's not going to spoil anything, but I think it's just good to give this information now because I think by knowing this information, it really helps you understand a little bit more of like these characters. So like I said, Thorin was a small child at the time of the attack, and he's the oldest of all of these dwarves as well. Balin and Dalin are the next oldest, but they were the equivalents of infants and toddlers when the dragon attacked, and so we can infer that they don't actually remember any of it happening. And the rest were born after the exile. And just a special note about Fili and Kili, who are the youngest at 77 and 82 dwarf years, which is essentially older teenagers / young adults in our time, in our experience. And it's basically, according to Tolkien later in like the appendix, so he talks about it later in appendices in Lord of the Rings. But it's like basically the only reason that they were even allowed to be as part of the company is because they are Thorin's nephews, with Fili being his heir since Fili is the oldest. And their mother is Thorin's younger sister. And basically, again, I kind of wish that they said it in The Hobbit because we don't really find out till like the appendices way later. But she's actually the one in charge while Thorin's away. She's not even called the queen. She's the acting king.
But
of them.
But I think a part of that is Tolkien hadn't thought that far yet.
Maybe because he always had Fili and Kili as the nephews.
Right.
He just forgot to mention it at like that's what he says. He just forgot to mention it. And just them being the youngest. And at this same time, at this period, we know Glóin as Gimli's dad. And we see him later in Lord of the Rings. And so at this time, like there's a small throwaway line in the Lord of the Rings, and I mentioned it there too, where Gimli's like he wished that he would have been on this journey as well. He's the equivalent of 62, which is a young teenager, compared to 72 and 82. So he was still considered much too young to go. And obviously he wasn't like related to the king. So, but I just thought that was an interesting thing, and it's talked about, but it's like I want to reiterate it again in the story. It's just the rest of them. While the two older ones, Balin and Dalin, are also like loosely related to royalty as well, the rest are not related to the royal line. They are chosen due to particular skills that they excel in. So it's just something that I just think it's like interesting.
A bigger rabbit hole than mine.
But mine's so it's just something that I think is just kind of important to kind of keep in mind as we're reading it,
Is this information that is like in the book, or is it stuff you found outside of the book?
Isn't it part of the appendices?
Yeah, it's part of so we know, so in the books, like Kili and Fili are described as the youngest. Like even in this introduction, and you do, and it's like, and the thing is, like, in earlier works, they were like mentioned as the nephews, but it was taken out and put back in so many times, like in different parts, that most people, like most Tolkien scholars, agree that it's probably something you should know up front rather than later.
But that's my point, is like, is it something that's ever mentioned in the book, or is this like when people talk about like the Star Wars EU?
I want to say it is mentioned at one point in the books.
Yeah.
I can never, it depending on which edition you're reading is where it is.
Yeah,
because some have it in this chapter, some have it in like the very last chapter,
right,
and others in like the middle somewhere. So
Okay.
because it constantly moves, I just wanted to like say it off the bat, because in some editions it is in the first chapter and sometimes it's not. Does that help?
Yes.
Who knew a book would have so much controversy over how it's written and when it's written?
Robert, when was the first time you read The Hobbit?
First time I read The Hobbit, I think I was a freshman in high school.
Did you read it before or after Lord of the Rings? I don't think I know that.
No, I think I read it after The Lord of the Rings.
Which would have been in what year?
Oh, so that's why you didn't like the song. They're not quite as important as they are in the Hobbit.
And what's really interesting is I had a friend of mine reading a satire of Lord of the Rings, and it was a book called The Board of the Rings
by the Harvard Lampoon.
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh, that sounds like that sounds interesting." He goes, "No, you got to read these books in order to understand that book."
What year do you think you read The Hobbit? Because I was wondering if you've noticed them ever updating it after the fact, since they're constantly finding stuff.
So that would have been freshman in high school, would have been 75 to 76. And
last updated was 79, I believe. It was done in 72, but published in 79.
Yeah.
So that's a great question, actually. Do you recall like the changes?
No, because I mean, first of all, that was a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So I don't remember when I started noticing the changes.
Mm.
That may not have been until I actually started getting to the scholarly stuff.
Okay.
I can't imagine what it would be like to read a book and then they're like, psych, we're going to update this like a couple of years later, you know?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Well, and a lot,
since they did it, like, especially if you read it when it first came out and it like really kept going.
I'm sure it's how people feel about them editing, you know, A New Hope and the Star Wars movies of like, is that really necessary?
I'm going to say it because I know you're going to go too much, Dad, but that's something that, so we're recording this a couple days before the episode comes out of Tolkien's influence on literature after Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And that's something that we talk about, is that the guy that wrote down his theory about the hero's journey, which is very influential,
Joseph Campbell,
he wrote it at the same time Tolkien was writing Lord of the Rings, though all the research shows they never talked at all during this point. So Lord of the Rings especially is like, it's used as a perfect example, not only of the hero's journey, but of multiple characters having this hero's journey. And The Hobbit is a perfect example of this. And he and Campbell, they never had any of these conversations.
Well, that's the point. You don't have to. It's Man with I think it's Man with 1,000 Faces or whatever it's called. I'm going to have to resist the urge to not make my normal Harry Potter jokes of, do you think Tolkien stole the idea of dragons liking treasure from Harry Potter? Because I know that's going to set off Smurf.
So I actually have something about that
here.
Chapter 2.
Okay. Sure. I mean, we always make I always make a Harry Potter or Taylor Swift reference, usually both, in an episode. So you're totally fine.
Hi guys, it's Editing Evelyn. Unfortunately, our sign-off got interrupted and weird, so I'll just sign off here saying thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you for welcoming Amy and Evie onto the pod, and we hope you guys enjoy it. You've been listening to Tolkien About It.